Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun had already stolen the moisture from the land by mid-morning, and the desert stretched out like a cracked, golden sea. Gideon North pulled his horse to a stop near a cluster of boulders that offered the only shade for miles. He swung down, dust clouding around his boots, and reached for his canteen as the mare snorted beneath him. Then he saw her. A woman, stumbling along the edge of the dry wash, her dress torn and face burned red from the sun. She walked like someone who had not had water in days, arms limp, eyes dazed. She carried a bundle close to her chest that he first thought was a bedroll, but when it gave out a weak cry, he froze. A baby. Gideon's legs were moving before his mind caught up. He jogged the 20 yards between them, heart thudding harder with every step. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, steady, "you need to stop walking. You're gonna fall." She blinked at him like he was a mirage. "Water," she rasped. He handed her his canteen, guiding it to her cracked lips. She drank too fast, coughing, but he steadied her until she got it down. Then, carefully, he peeled back the cloth over the baby's face. A boy, maybe a year old, cheeks sunken, lips dry, Gideon poured a little water onto a corner of his bandana and dabbed it onto the baby's mouth. The boy whined softly, then latched onto his mother's dress. "Is there anyone else with you?" he asked. "No," she whispered. "Just us." Gideon looked out across the desert. No wagon, no tracks, just heat and dust and the buzz of flies. He set a hand against her back to keep her from falling. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rowena," she said faintly. "Rowena Kline." "All right, Rowena, my name's Gideon North." He glanced at the baby. "And him?" She looked down at the boy with love and exhaustion heavy in her face. "Zeke." Gideon nodded once. "I got a horse just over there." "We're getting you both out of this heat." She did not argue. She could not. He lifted her into the saddle, then handed Zeke up into her arms. She held the boy tight against her chest, arms trembling. Gideon walked beside the horse, one hand steady on the reins, the other holding the canteen. By the time they reached his ranch, just a modest stretch of land outside Bisbee, Rowena had passed out in the saddle, Zeke sleeping weakly against her. Gideon got them inside and laid her on the cot in the main room, then set the baby in a basket padded with clean cloth. He worked fast. Boiled water. Fed Zeke a little goat's milk with a spoon. Wiped down Rowena's sunburned face and arms with cool cloths. She barely stirred. For 2 days she slept. On the third morning he was changing Zeke's cloth when he heard her voice behind him. You saved us." He turned. She was sitting up, hair tangled, eyes tired but clear. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "You were out there alone," he said. "I could not ride past that." Rowena looked down at her hands. "We were trying to make it to Fort Bowie. My brother left us behind. Said we were slowing him down." Gideon's chest tightened. "You had no wagon." He took it. "Said I had enough food and water to last a day." Her jaw tensed. He was wrong. Gideon felt the heat rise behind his ribs. He kept his voice soft. "You and Zeke are safe now. You can rest here as long as you need." Her eyes met his, slow and cautious. "I do not want to be trouble." "You are not trouble, Rowena." He stood, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Come eat. I made eggs." She rose slowly, legs still shaky, and followed him to the small table. Zeke babbled softly from the basket, a little stronger now, cheeks already filling out. They ate in silence, but it was not awkward, just quiet. Tired. Later, while Zeke napped in the shade outside, Gideon handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Where are you going to go?" he asked. Rowena stared out over the hills, her fingers wrapped tight around the cup. "I do not know," she said. "I have no family left, no money, just Zeke." Gideon studied her, the way her shoulders curled like she was used to bracing for the worst. The way her eyes flicked to Zeke every few minutes, like she was half afraid he might disappear too. "You could stay here," he said. Rowena blinked. "Stay? You and Zeke, I have room, and more work than I can do alone." Her fingers tightened on the cup. "You do not even know me." "I know you were willing to cross the desert alone to protect your boy," he said. "That tells me enough." She looked down, quiet, then gave a small nod. "We can help. I can cook, men, tend the animals." "I believe you," Gideon said, and meant it. That night, after she put Zeke to sleep, Rowena sat with Gideon on the porch. The desert cooled around them, stars spilling over the sky like gold dust. She tucked her knees up to her chest, her voice soft. "I thought we were going to die out there." Gideon's hand rested on his knee. "You did not." She turned her face toward him. Because of you. He looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Zeke stirred gently inside, then went quiet again. Rowena's voice broke the silence. Why are you alone out here? Gideon shrugged. Family passed on. I grew up drifting, worked ranches, drove cattle, bought this land 5 years back, been here since. She watched him. You ever think about having a family? He looked away, but not far, just to the stars. More than anything. Rowena nodded slowly. Me too. They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind this time, not tired, not afraid, just full. When Rowena stood to go inside, she paused beside him. Thank you, Gideon, she said, for everything. He looked up at her, eyes steady. You are welcome, Rowena. And in the quiet, the first thread of something new stretched between them, soft and real. Not just survival, not just gratitude, something more. The heat had broken 3 days later, swept off the Dragoon foothills by a dusty wind that rattled the porch shingles and left the air bearable again. Rowena stood at the edge of the corral, Zeke balanced on her hip, watching Gideon work a mule that had gone half feral over the winter. The animal bucked against the lead rope, ears pinned back, but Gideon's movements stayed patient, precise, like he was listening for something only he could hear. Rowena adjusted Zeke, who had dozed off with his thumb pressed against his lower lip. She didn't speak until Gideon led the mule toward the gate, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. I can take that fence rail down for you, she said, nodding toward the far post. He glanced up. You sure he won't wake? Not unless thunder hits the roof, she said, easing Zeke into the shade of the cottonwood before slipping off her shoes. She moved with care, fingers finding the knots in the rope and loosening them until the rail dropped clean. Gideon led the mule through, then gave her a quiet look of thanks. She didn't miss how his eyes lingered, not in a way that unsettled her, but like he was trying to memorize the shape of her standing there in the sun. He rubbed his hands clean on his trousers. You ever handle stock before? My father had a few goats. I helped him with birthing when I was old enough not to faint at the smell. Gideon gave a short laugh, not mocking. You faint easy. Not once since I was 12, she said, brushing her skirts straight. He leaned on the fence, arms crossed. You said your brother took the wagon. How far behind him do you think you were? Rowena hesitated. 2 days, maybe 3. He wasn't the type to look back. That land past the wash gets rough. If he ran short on supplies, he might have turned toward the river. I doubt he turned at all, she said, voice flat. He was chasing gold rumors up near Clifton. Gideon didn't push further. A hawk circled overhead, casting flickers of shadow across the ground. The silence turned companionable, broken only by Zeke's soft breathing under the tree. Rowena picked a burr from her sleeve. I should start washing. That shirt's seen better days. He glanced down. Ain't the only one, he said, brushing dust from his trousers. There's lye soap in the shed. You'll have to pump the water, slow handle sticks if you force it, she nodded. I can manage, she had. By dusk, 2 shirts and a pair of trousers hung from the line behind the house, swaying faintly in the breeze. Rowena's fingers were red from scrubbing, but her movements stayed steady as she chopped roots for stew. Zeke sat nearby on a blanket, mouthing a wooden spoon and watching the firelight flicker. Gideon sat across from her, close enough to pass the tin pot back and forth, far enough that their knees didn't touch. He didn't speak until she had eaten half her bowl. You planning to go into town come month's end? Rowena paused, spoon hovering. Didn't know I was. Supple'll run thin. You'll need cloth for Zeke, maybe flour if the weevils get into the sack. She nodded slowly. I've never seen Bisbee. It's mostly copper men and dust, one good mercantile, a saddle shop if you've got money, which most folks don't. I could stitch for trade. I'm quick with a needle. Gideon watched her, something unreadable passing through his face. You don't owe anything here. You know that. She looked at him then, really looked, the firelight catching the ridges of his cheekbones and the faint line above his brow where some old scar had healed tight. I don't want to be idle. You're not. Still, she rose early the next morning and swept the porch, patched 2 shirts and soaked beans for supper. She said little, but her presence changed the rhythm of the house quietly, like someone rearranging stones in a creek so the current ran smoother. Zeke laughed more, toddled farther from her reach, and fell asleep curled into Gideon's coat one afternoon when he drifted too far from the shade. That evening, Rowena stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching as Gideon lifted Zeke and carried him inside like he was something small and sacred. "You're good with him," she said softly. He didn't look at her, just adjusted Zeke's weight and laid him down with surprising gentleness. "He's easy to care for. He's never taken to another man like that. He's got sense then." She stepped into the room, the lantern light catching the edge of her collarbone. "You ever think of marrying?" Gideon's hands stilled over the blanket. "I did once. Long time back." "What happened?" "She married someone else." He turned then, met her eyes without flinching. "Didn't want a man who couldn't promise more than sweat and dirt." Rowena didn't smile. "Some of us learned too late that the ones who promise the most often give the least." He nodded once. "Maybe we're both better off now." She crossed the floor to him, slow, deliberate. "Maybe." They stood there, the space between them narrowing, the quiet not heavy but full of something waiting to be named. Gideon didn't move to touch her, and she didn't reach for him, but the air shifted all the same. Zeke stirred and Rowena stepped back, smoothing her skirt. "He'll wake hungry. I should heat the milk." Gideon watched her go, then leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes soft. Outside, the stars blinked open one by one, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something gentler beneath it, like the beginning of belonging. The late July sun had softened some. Its glare filtered through high clouds that promised nothing but shade. Gideon stood at the edge of the garden rose, a hoe balanced loosely in his hand as Rowena knelt nearby, pressing green bean shoots into the earth with quick, practiced fingers. Zeke sat in the dirt beside her, crumbling a clump of soil between his palms, his hands and cheeks streaked with dust. "Your rows are straighter than mine," Gideon said, squinting down at her work. Rowena glanced up, brushing a curl from her brow with the back of her wrist. "My father used to say crooked rows meant a crooked heart." Gideon arched a brow. "Then I must be a sorry case." She smiled without looking at him again, and he felt the way the air shifted, not heavy, not loaded, just full of something low and steady building between them. They worked until cloudlight began to fade, and the wind picked up from the south, stirring the mesquite branches along the fence line. After supper, when Zeke had been washed and tucked onto a bed of quilts near the hearth, Rowena stood at the wash basin, wringing out a cloth with slow, even turns of her wrists. "You ever been to New Mexico?" she asked without turning. "Once," Gideon said, leaning against the doorframe. "Drove cattle through the Black Range, got caught in a flash flood down near Silver City, lost 2 steers and a boot." She turned slightly, a strand of hair falling loose at her temple. "You ever think about going back?" "I thought about heading east once," he said. "But out there I always felt like I was just visiting someone else's world. Here, even the silence makes sense." She nodded, then reached for the towel to dry her hands. "My mother came from Santa Fe." She used to tell stories about the old plaza, with lanterns hung on every window at Christmas time. "You take after her." Rowena folded the towel carefully. "She had soft hands, I don't." Gideon stepped forward, his boots quiet against the plank floor. "I don't think softness has much to do with hands." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, her breath held for half a second too long. Then she turned away, picking up Zeke's small shirt to mend a loose hem. "I've been thinking," she said, settling at the table. "If I take in some sewing from folks in town, maybe we could trade for a goat. Zeke's been drinking less from the crock lately." "You want to bring him with you into Bisbee?" Gideon asked. "No, not yet. He tires too fast. If someone could stay with him." "I can," he said quickly. "He's fine with me." Rowena's needle paused in midair. "You sure?" "Sheepdog trusts me," he said. "Your son's no more trouble than that." She gave a tight, amused breath and bent back to her stitching. "Then I'll go. I can leave at first light, take the wagon road. Should be back by sundown. You'll take my horse and the rifle." "I don't need a rifle." He leaned both hands on the table, his voice low. "Take it anyway." Rowena looked up, her eyes steady. "You think I'm still in danger?" "I think the desert doesn't care who's prepared and who isn't." She didn't argue after that, just nodded and folded the shirt once she finished the seam. The next morning, she left early, bundled in a pale blue shawl and carrying a satchel with her thread and needles tucked safe inside. Gideon stood with Zeke in his arms, the boy chewing on a corner of his blanket and blinking slowly in the morning light. "She'll be back before dark," Gideon said softly, mostly for Zeke's sake. Zeke didn't answer, but the weight of him in Gideon's arms felt like something firm and certain, the kind of trust that didn't ask questions. They spent the day in quiet rhythm. Gideon carried the boy down to the creek, where they sat under cottonwoods and listened to water skip over stone. Zeke napped on Gideon's chest, his breath warm through the linen shirt, his fingers curled into Gideon's collar like he belonged there and always had. By the time the sun started to drop behind the hills, Gideon had stoked the fire and set a pot of beans to simmer. He paced the porch twice, then paused to listen for hooves. When they came, soft and steady down the gravel road, he felt tension ease from his shoulders. Rowena rode up with her satchel packed full and a burlap sack tied behind the saddle. She slid down from the horse before he could reach her cheeks flushed from sun and wind. "I brought cloth, dried apples, and a spool of thick black thread," she said, brushing dust from her hem. "And a goat," his brow furrowed. "Where is it?" Coming up behind me. I paid a boy to walk it as far as the ridge, had to trade 2 stitched handkerchiefs and a dozen buttons for the harness. Gideon laughed, short and surprised. "You're dangerous with a needle." Rowena didn't smile. She reached up, touched his arm lightly. Zeke do all right, did more than all right. She stepped past him to the doorway, then paused. "Someone at the store asked if I was your wife." He stayed still, the breeze lifting dust off the porch rail. "What you say?" I said, "Not yet." She didn't wait for a reply, just stepped inside and bent to gather Zeke up from the quilt where he played with a carved wooden horse. Gideon followed slowly, heart thudding, the door creaking closed behind him as the sun fell away from the windows. The goat bleated once and kicked the stall wall just before dawn. Gideon rolled out of bed slowly, pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders with a stiff yawn. From the other room came the soft creak of Rowena's bare feet on the floorboards, then the low murmur of her voice as she soothed Zeke from a dream. He built the fire back up till the coals glowed steady, then stepped outside. The air held a coolness that wouldn't last. He worked the pump until water splashed into the tin pail, then stooped to fill the goat's trough. Inside, Rowena fed Zeke mashed beans left from supper while Gideon fried cornmeal cakes, the skillet spitting quietly over the flame. When she joined him at the table, she brought a folded scrap of paper from her sewing kit. "I drew up a pattern," she said, turning it toward him. "For a proper shirt, one that'll fit you through the shoulders." He glanced down at the sketch. "That mean you're tired of seeing me in sleeves too short?" "I'm tired of patching the same one at the elbows," she said, her tone light. He nodded once, tapping the paper with a calloused finger. "I'll trade you the lumber from the shed rafters." "Been meaning to clear them out." She leaned back a little, studying him. "You planning something?" "I've got enough timber to build a room off the back," he said, voice even. "Wouldn't take more than 3 days if I start early. Could put in a window. Give you and Zeke some space." Rowena touched her fingers to the edge of her cup. "You don't have to do that, I know." She didn't answer right away. "Then, you always build things for people who haven't asked, only when I want them to stay." She looked at him and something softened behind her eyes, something she didn't try to hide. Later that morning, while Zeke napped in a wash of sunlight near the open door, Gideon sorted through the planks stacked along the shed wall. He measured each one twice, then laid a frame out in the dirt. Rowena joined him with 2 mugs of coffee, setting one on an overturned bucket near his elbow. "You mean to dig footings?" she asked, brushing a splinter from a board. "I'll use stone from the ridge, set it level and brace the joists tight." She crouched beside him, running her hand along the grain of a beam. "I can paint it once it's up. My mother used to mix buttermilk and ash for whitewash. I'll leave you the south wall." By midday, they'd cleared the ground and roughed in the base. Rowena hauled water while Gideon hammered, and when the baby woke, she brought him out wrapped in a light blanket. He sat beside her in the dirt, chewing on a scrap of rawhide while she watched Gideon raise the first frame into place. That night, after Zeke had fallen asleep with his feet tucked beneath a quilt Gideon had found in a trunk long untouched, Rowena sat beside him on the porch steps. Her hair was still damp from washing, and the air smelled of sawdust and summer grass. I used to think I'd settle east of the river, she said, near where my mother's family lived, but it never worked out that way. You miss it. I miss the mountains. But not what came with them. He waited, but she didn't go on. Instead, she leaned back on her hands, looking out toward the low hills where the moon had begun to rise. I've lived a long time waiting for someone to show me I wasn't just something to carry through a storm, she said quietly. He didn't speak, just reached over and took her hand. She let him. They stayed like that until the lantern inside flickered low and the wind shifted from the west. When they finally stood, neither let go. The next morning came with the smell of dew on stone and the sound of Zeke babbling to himself. Gideon found the boy sitting on the floor, stacking wooden clothespins into uneven towers. Rowena stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. I'm sewing that shirt today, she said without turning, so don't get caught in the fence again. Gideon laughed under his breath and stepped onto the porch to fetch his work gloves. By sundown, the new walls stood framed and true, and Zeke had taken his first steps between them, toddling from Rowena's outstretched hands toward Gideon's boots. She caught her breath and looked over at Gideon, her expression stunned and shining. He crouched low, scooping the boy up with one arm. That's a good place to start walking, he said. Rowena stepped close then, close enough that her skirt brushed his knee. She reached out, touching Gideon's chest lightly above his heart. You don't just build with wood, she said. He looked at her, and in the quiet between them, something rooted. Not fast, not loud, but deep and lasting. The wall went up just before the monsoon rains came. Gideon secured the final beams with wide-shouldered steadiness, and Rowena, standing below with her skirts tied up and her sleeves rolled, handed tools without needing to be asked. Zeke sat in a crate nearby, chewing on a strip of dried apple, his bare feet swinging above the packed dirt. By the time the first drops hit, the roof had been papered with oilcloth and pressed flat with smooth stones. They stood under the overhang, rain tracing silver lines down the edges, and Rowena reached for Gideon's hand wordlessly, her fingers rough from stitching, strong from work. Inside, the new room smelled of cut pine and damp wool from the blanket she'd already laid over the cot. A single pane of glass, salvaged from a mining shack Gideon had repaired the year before, let in the waning light. She had placed a tin box on the shelf above it, filled with thread and a folded letter she never opened. That night, while Zeke slept in the new cot with his thumb tucked beneath his chin, Rowena stood in the doorway, the lantern's glow warming one side of her face. I want to stay here, she said. Gideon straightened from where he was checking the latches on the front windows. You already are, she shook her head. Not just to rest, I mean for good, if you want that. He stepped toward her, slow. I do. She didn't smile, but her eyes held something steady and bright. Then I should tell you what I haven't yet. All right, my first husband drank. Took to rage when things didn't bend his way. I left with Zeke before he could hand that down to him. She looked down. I thought maybe you'd ask about the boy's name, but you never did. I figured it was yours to give. She looked up, something loosening in her shoulders. It was my father's. He never raised his voice, only his hopes. I wanted that name to mean something again. Gideon reached forward and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing the edge of her temple slowly. You've already made it mean something better. Everything after that came without rush. The days lengthened, the rains passed, and the ground turned soft enough to start a new garden plot behind the shed. Gideon carved a cradle from spare boards, planed smooth and rubbed with oil until it shone. Rowena stitched curtains for the new room, pale blue patterned with fading daisy vines left over from a bolt of fabric she'd traded for in Bisbee. They married under the cottonwood with no preacher present, just hands clasped and words spoken plain. The wind tugged at her shawl, and Zeke clapped when they kissed. In the weeks that followed, Rowena started baking once a week for a neighbor who'd lost his wife to fever. Gideon helped him mend his fence in return. Zeke grew stronger, his legs steadier, and took to following Gideon out to the barn each morning, holding a length of twine like it meant something. One evening, after the supper dishes had been dried and set back in their places, Rowena sat on the porch with Gideon beside her. He had just finished whittling a small horse for Zeke, the edges sanded round so it wouldn't splinter. Your hands are always busy, she said, running her fingers along his wrist. Even when you're still. They've got something to hold now, he answered. She turned her face toward him, the dusk softening the lines around her eyes. I never thought I'd feel safe again, not in the way that stays even when the doors are shut and the lamps are out. You are, he said, his voice low. You always will be. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the crickets started to sing. Years passed, not quickly, but in the quiet way that life moves when it's rooted deep. They built a smokehouse behind the barn, added 2 more goats, and traded for a second-hand loom that Rowena learned to use by trial and error. Zeke grew into a boy with strong legs and a sharp eye, who called Gideon Pa without ever being told to. One winter evening, as a fire snapped in the hearth and wind pressed against the shutters, Rowena laid a newborn girl into Gideon's arms. He held her like he had held Zeke that first day, careful, reverent, as though she were something rare that might not last. She's got your mother's mouth, he whispered. Rowena touched the baby's cheek. And your eyes. They named her Clara. The house expanded by 1 more room that spring, and Gideon carved a cradle just like the first, only this one he lined with quilt scraps sewn by Rowena's own hand. The land didn't change much. Seasons came and went. The garden grew and faded, and the cottonwoods thickened with age. But inside the house, laughter grew louder, footsteps multiplied, and the rooms held warmth even when the stove went cold. Most evenings, they sat on the porch, side by side, watching the sun slip behind the hills. Rowena often kept her hand tucked beneath his arm, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, while the children played in the yard or dozed on their laps. And when Gideon looked at her, he didn't see the desert-worn stranger he'd found near death. He saw the woman who had crossed the worst of the world and still carried gentleness in her hands. He saw the mother of his children, his partner in every quiet thing that made a life. They didn't speak of the past much anymore. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be carried. They had each other now, and the days stretched long and full ahead, built not just from survival, but from love that had been earned, nurtured, and made to last.